shortly get started. I'm going to present the presenters as we go through. Everyone should have about 15 minutes so that we have enough time at the end for some questions. Unfortunately, Desiree Hill will not be with us this morning, but Sherry Brown is here. She's from KMBC TV Kansas City, where she's the news director, and she's been there for over 9 years. She's also worked in Oklahoma City, Arkansas as news director as well. But prior to that, she was a reporter for 7 years. She's covered things like the Oklahoma City bombing, tornadoes, etc. She's been with First since 2000, and I was asking her if she was an expert of disasters just outside the newsroom, but she says both. So, welcome, Sherry.
Yeah, and I have to say right up front, I've never done this before. I've talked to classrooms and students before, and Desiree is really the brains behind the...
You need your presentation first.
Yeah.
But she's
Desiree's really behind the research part of it, but... So, first of all, thanks for having us. Even though Desiree isn't here, she got stuck in Chicago. So, the basis of this study really is to, there's much debate about the future of local news, local newspapers, local television stations, and broadcast groups. There's a lot of change. Technically, in our society, economic and political transformations are having a tremendous effect on journalism in local communities and around the world. Even though local viewership is down, revenue continues to grow. And audiences have many new and different ways of getting content, including online and mobile, and through social networks and non-traditional means. So Desiree had an interest in looking at the VRIN model as far as business and managing goes. I don't find that as interesting as the results, so I'm going to skip right through what a VRN is, but I'll do it really quick. What is VRN? It's value, rare, immutable, and non-substitutable. That means strategy advocated by Barney for traditional businesses, not specifically for media, but we were interested to take a look and see if there was value to this concept. Valuable is something of value to a media audience. Resources described as valuable, but which several, according to Barney, if all organizations described as valuable, the implementing the same strategy, no one firm gains a competitive advantage. You would argue that everybody has the same access to content. So really, how are you going to create your niche in a marketplace? So you have to look at what's rare. What is it that's difficult for the competition to get? And the competition cannot get the advantage in this type of situation. Non-substitutable values is no one else can get this advantage, which is difficult in media these days. You have to have a special talent or a special resource, such as an investigative team. In the study, we were interested in understanding how local news stations in the U.S. use VRIN for the strategy. So the research combines an in-depth interviews with 4 successful stations in large, medium, small markets, and local owners versus corporate owners. In the study was KMBC, my station, which is DMA market number 33, owned by Hearst Television, KTSF in San Francisco, which is a Chinese language station in Market 6 and independently owned, and KWTV, Oklahoma City, market size 41, independently owned by a family, and WHSV Harrisonburg, market 177, which is part of a smaller group, Gray Television. So we asked each to describe success. One of the common themes is ratings, which equals revenue, commitment to viewers, and in our case, we look at national awards because we want to hold our standards high. At KWTV, it's newsroom culture, in addition to all those. And then WHSV is growth, online revenue, employees. So in the results, KMBC, the Hearst television station, allows for a bigger picture of resources. There are 30 stations across the group, and I was interested to turn on TV this morning at the hotel and find Boston is one of those stations here. We also own WCVB, the ABC affiliate in Boston. So all these networks of television stations across the country, we combine and use and act like a little network. KWTV is locally owned, which allows the owner a quick reaction to all decisions that revolve around the local marketplace. In results, we measure them from demographic targets. At our station, we focus on people 25 to 54, and this also includes digital platforms. At KTSF, they focus on that specific those folks who speak that specific language. And female viewers at WHSV, they decided to super serve that viewer. Now the results as far as the content goes, you know, ours boils down to trust, especially in this time that we're in right now of fake news and you know, the political landscape. Really viewers we're seeing now more and more are focusing on the trust of their local television stations, our local journalists. So we've seen our numbers in digital and in ratings go up and continue to go up, and versus the cable news networks continue to go down. And their audience is older and not one of the types of audiences that advertisers necessarily want to advertise on, because the other thing is just the balance of coverage. Even the advertisers want an organization that can be trustworthy, balanced, you know, not opinionated, and perspective, context. KTSF gets stories that others can't from the Chinese community, and KWTV more stories because they have more people. Since it's a smaller organization and family-owned, they hire more people and invest in them that way. At WHSV, weather is another important factor, the local forecast, and they focus on doing updates every hour. The results in training and recruitment was also a thing that differentiated these television stations and led to success. KMBC, we have company initiatives that includes recruitment we hold a producer academy, which is underway right now in Orlando, Florida, where we send in the best of the best and grow producers and develop them. And we believe they will be the future leaders in the newsrooms. We also invest a lot in weather training, because weather cannot be copied by you know, network organizations. They can't focus on weather as much. And also we have our own live radar, which nobody else does in the marketplace. And KTSF, its staff is from the community, and so again, it comes down to trust. KWTV, local ownership, allows us to take better care of their people, so they grow, again, building that relationship and that culture in the newsroom. They are from the community and they invest in the community. WHSV, the question is, their goal is that everybody get better every day. Again, it's that investment in people. Even though they're a smaller market, those folks want to get into a larger market, make more money, and have more responsibilities. So their investment is to grow their people each and every day. So the bottom line, the findings, ownership can matter. You know, there's a connection to training and recruitment. It is difficult for media companies to execute VRIN. All entities have to have access to the same news. Niche broadcasters, KTSF, have advantages. Success for new media follows a pattern of overall results: ownership, demographic targets, content, training, and recruitment. Thank you very much.
Who's the marketing director at Global News since 2013. Prior to this, she's worked as a media consultant in advertising and also promotion producer. She's also been at CTV, and she's been in the TV industry for 20 years.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, thanks for having me, everybody. I found yesterday really interesting, and as a marketer, I don't know if I'm the only marketer in the room, but just, you know, listening to what our viewers want and what what's happening in the industry, I just found fascinating. So, but I did a little bit of research on my own, not because I'm a student or work for a university, but just because I was mad. So I was mad, and I thought, gosh, I go to all the conferences in the States, and I just see how much promotion they do, and all their creative's so awesome. And I was like, what are they doing? What do they do? What do they know that we don't? So this is what I just wanted to set the scene here. And I know, Sherry, we and I talked about earlier, there's some layoffs and stuff happening in the States and things like that. But this is just from January 2017. Just a little research. Adding an hour-long new newscast. Adding 1 hour of local news in the morning. Addition to what they had before. Adding 90 minutes of local news on the weekends. Adding 1 hour of evening news in Chicago. Launching a local afternoon newscast at 3:30 in the afternoon. Like, that just doesn't happen in Canada, ever. Adding an hour of local news at 9 p.m. Adding a half hour of local morning news on all 3 stations. Going back to a full hour at noon, because I guess they cut back, and they're like, no, that didn't work for us, we're going to go back to an hour. Adding a local midday newscast at 11 a.m. Adding an hour of, these are just articles from January 2017. So while we're cutting back in Canada and really skeleton staff and, cutting back the hours of news locally, this is what's happening just south of the border, and it just blew my mind. So again, I'm just going to plow through these because, I could go through. Look, they're adding jobs in Buffalo, everybody. You know why? They took away their sports coverage, and now they're adding it back. And it didn't work for them. They realized it was a mistake, and they're adding it back. So, it's all from where you're looking at it. But I wanted to find out, what are they doing? What do they know that we don't know? So how do they keep adding hours and hours of local news in all these markets? And that's just in 6 months. So what they know is, local TV stations are profitable not only because of advertising dollars there, but the support and growth of the cable retransmission funds. We don't have that here in Canada. The CRTC gives a little bit of money, but nothing like the retransmission fees that they get in the States. In fact, some stations earn up to 40% of their revenue because of these retransmission fees. And it's just for carriage, right? We don't get that here. We're supported by the entertainment dollars. So again, they also know that local news programming, more is better every time. Because you're serving the local audience. It's just, you're serving the actual viewer that's living there. So they also know that local station that is #1 in news ratings is usually #1 in overall ratings and total dollar revenue in that market. I could say that that's probably true up until this year in Toronto in particular. CTV is the #1 newscast here, but they are not the #1 dollar revenue generator this year. I don't know why that is, but it's not. It didn't happen for them this year. They also know, the Americans also know, that virtually all of the 800 plus affiliates, can you imagine? Anyway, TV stations in the United States, promotion of news has the highest priority. In Canada, we are the lowest, unfortunately. They also know that local network affiliates in the top 100 markets, and even more, not just even the top 100 markets, as I was talking to Sherry earlier, subscribe to outside research companies for analysis to work with the station on their content delivery and revenue. How can we deliver better content to our viewers, and then how do we turn that around and make revenue from it? And what do we do here in Canada? So, well, when we were at all the sessions yesterday, when asked, the majority of Canadians value and trust local television news, which is good news. That's the one good thing. And I only have, I'm a marketer because I only have like one chart. One chart, but it's true. And April said it, 92% of people surveyed, and I don't even think it's from the same survey because this is from the friends.ca poll, but they still believe and trust local news, and they want it. But why aren't they watching it then? Why are ratings declining? So, so we know the want is there, but why is there a decline in ratings? They have told, they want us there. They want us to deliver local news, but they're not watching. So revenue is declining. Sorry. I was writing this all out. So if it all really boils down to revenue, what do other industries do, as a marketer, what do other industries do when they have a revenue problem? let's like think about, like, if you were like Coca-Cola and you weren't making money, what would you do? So you'd do research. You'd figure out why you're not making money. Why are people not drinking Coca-Cola? Or why people are not watching local news, first of all. Then you'd learn from that research, and you'd update and improve the product so it meets the consumer's wants and needs. And then you'd advertise the product. I've always said this, and my news directors, whatever news director I work for, it drives them crazy because I always say, you can have the best show in the world. If nobody knows about it, they're not going to watch it. They're not going to know it's there. So you've got to tell them it's there. But in Canada, we don't give enough promotion time to local news, and that's a huge, huge problem. So if there's anything we can learn from studying others, something we can look at is simply airtime, like I talked about. It's something all broadcasters have, even Canada, United States, Europe, everywhere. We all have promotional airtime. It doesn't really cost us anything. I mean, we have to part with it and maybe not sell it to an advertiser, but are we going to get it in the back end? So let's take a look. I took a look at that. So what do American local TV stations dedicate to promotion for local news? So do they? Let's see. I talked to people I know in these markets, and so I took out whether it's ABC, NBC, CBS, just to make it fair. So people go, what? They get that much in Chicago? Anyway, and this is what they're doing. In prime time, they get between 40 and 50 seconds an hour in prime time, which is pretty good. So, I mean, I'm not going to go through the whole chart, but something really interesting that happens is who controls that promotional airtime? In all those markets that I spoke to, my pals in those markets, local sales traffic controls that. In Canada, the network controls it. So our main network, the big wigs in Toronto, sitting in offices in Toronto, are the ones that control the local airtime across the country. But again, and I took out CBC, CTV, but I love my interns. Last year, I had 3 interns, and we PVR'd primetime and fringe on all our competitor stations. And I made them go through every single commercial break. They were awesome. I love those guys. Anyway, this is what they came up with. So this is, on average, what they're getting. And let's compare it. So in the States, they're getting, in prime time, 45 to 60 seconds an hour. In Canada, we get about 30, if we're lucky. Fringe, they get 1:30 an hour. Here, we get 30 to 45. So let's look at that. Like, that's huge. In total, when you look from 6 a.m. to 11, they get 19 minutes a day of local news promotion in the United States. A day, 19 minutes a day. In Canada, we dedicate maybe 9 minutes a day to our local newscast. So they win. They win. They get it. They get it, and it drives me nuts that we don't get it here. But you know, I go to my local schedulers all the time and go, hi, I'm giving them flowers and chocolates, and they're like, I can't help you. It's controlled by the network, right? They tell us what they can put in there and what they can't. So, you know, it's unfortunate. So really quick, I just wanted to, these are some quotes that I've used in other presentations that I think really hit home. So for the vast majority of television stations offering local news, the newscast itself has become the primary tool for creating the station's overall brand and image. So you think, we've done surveys, CBC's done surveys, CTV's done surveys, you do brand health surveys. So when someone says, oh, what do you think of when you think of global? People automatically say global news. They don't say Survivor. They don't say whatever other show we have. They say global news. And if you ask CTV people, what do you think of when you think of CTV? They go, CTV News. They don't say, oh, Amazing Race. Yeah, they have Amazing Race. So to me, it just develops your brand, which how could you not promote yourself? Anyway, the other thing is local news is more PVR proof, other than when my interns did that for me, but local news is more PVR proof than any other programming, and it also exceeds all other forms of TV programming in terms of generating advertising awareness. So if I was an advertiser and I really want to hit a target audience like adults 25-54 who have the money, I'm going to buy local news. That's what I'm going to do. Anyway, so what do Canadian broadcasters need to do to keep viewers? It's pretty easy. We need to invest and not give up on local news, TV news, and newspaper and radio. They need to keep using research and listening to consumers to improve and give the viewers what they want and need from local news. We need to dedicate more airtime. I'm like preaching the converted, I know, but I mean, I've presented this to my VP and he understands too, but he also doesn't control the airtime. The network controls the airtime. And then I just want to show you something really quick because I show this in all my presentations and I just want to cheer after hearing it. Hopefully it plays.
All TV news other than local news is irrelevant.
All TV news except why do you say that?
Because people watch local news. I've always thought that the last one standing is going to be a local television station. I think they're going on forever because they are the ones organized to deal with their local community, and people like to know about things in their area. So weather, sports, local is always going to be relevant for television.
You think 60 Minutes is
No, I'm sorry. No, sorry. I'm saying commodity. I'm not saying 60 Minutes. I'm not saying documentaries and specials and things like that. But I'm saying the evening news, the concept of the evening news, just as I mean, it has an audience, but that audience, as you know, is declining. It's no longer relevant. And as again, I just think local news is you can't find a technological better for that than local television.
Yay! I love that. You have to, I hope Monica Auer is going to begin our presentation. She's the Executive Director of the Forum for Research in Policy and Communications. It's a nonprofit corporation founded in 2013 in Ottawa to undertake research and advocate on behalf of the public interest in Canadian broadcasting and telecommunications. In addition to an undergraduate degree in French and German, Monica has undergraduate and graduate degrees in political science and law, and has been practicing administrative law in Ottawa since 2006. She also has 2.25 kids and 1.5 cats, or perhaps the other way around. For myself, I'm an associate professor at the University of Ottawa. I've been involved in various facets of radio, and radio is not dead, I'm telling you, for close to 20 years, too. And have worked in all 3 sectors. And other than radio, I've also worked in HR and the media industry, and for 2 weeklies as a freelancer. These days, I spend most of my time researching and evaluating media policy. However, I do find time to be a board member on the FRPC and also a public adjudicator with the CBSC when I'm not taking care of my 4 kids and 1 cat.
Thanks, Genevieve. That was great, and I appreciate the invitation to speak by the organizers. The context that I'm going to be dealing with today is the legal framework. We all know that the law exists. We always watch for cops when we're speeding or when we're going through traffic lights. The law exists to protect all of us, to protect society. You may be surprised to know that broadcasting has been regulated in Canada since actually 1905, before it was actually invented. Telegraphy was invented and licensed well in the 1800s. There have always been statutes governing communications. I did a paper on new media dating back to 5000 BC, and there were laws about communications in 5000 BC. We're not going to escape law in broadcasting. There have been 2 key changes over time between 1905 and 1991. The first is that licensing moved from being in direct government control, the ministers granted licenses, and second, to a situation here where we have a quasi-judicial independent agency, the CRTC. Just so you know, the CRTC could consist of up to 13 different commissioners, one of whom is the chair. We now have 6, one of whom is a woman. There are no persons of color. They were all appointed by the Conservative Party of Canada. In 1968, for the first time, Parliament moved to protect local news because the 1991 Act actually includes a specific section on broadcast news. It requires the system to provide information. It requires the system to be varied and comprehensive and provide a balance of information. So now we have express protection. There are 3 major issues with this wonderful section in the Act. First is that we're talking about the entire system, not individual undertakings. Second, we're talking about a should, which is a discretionary power, which means we don't have to do it. And as we've just heard, it doesn't happen. And third, and this is an important hidden problem, decision-making about broadcasting in Canada moved from the entire commission of 13 people to individual panels who are all appointed by the chair. If you have one chair choosing all the members, they can actually effectively determine outcomes. I've looked at the regulation of broadcast journalism in the local communities between 1968 and 1990. I did that by reviewing all of the decisions, all of the policies, all of the orders. Before 1991, the CRTC actually made and enforced policies for local news. Commitments to local original news were conditions of license and were enforceable. In 1991, before 1991, the CRTC also often addressed licensing, staffing, how many events were being covered, and they demanded that broadcasters cover more news. In one case, the CRTC actually denied a license renewal because the station had changed broadcasts so as not to offend advertisers. Fast forward to 91, the CRTC says for the first time, well, one of the first time, that news is critical. It's fundamental to democracy. We've got to have news. So what have we seen since 1991? In 1991, the CRTC eliminated all requirements for non-news local programming. So all that was left was news. In 1992, it eliminated all spoken word requirements for radio. In 1993, it said, sure, you have to do a third of your programming local, and it has to include news, which is kind of a loophole because if you have a minute a week, you've got news. By 1999, there were no requirements for local news in Canadian television. The CRTC started to get complaints. It established a $60 million fund, the Local Programming Improvement Fund, with a slight hitch that it didn't enforce any of the expenditures direction towards local programming. So you could use it to buy new trucks. It didn't matter. It was great. They ended it in 2014. So what happened after the 91 Act, which specifically said we want news? Staffing in both radio and TV fell. We don't know whether it's staffing on news in particular because unfortunately the CRTC doesn't collect journalism on broadcast, doesn't collect data on broadcast journalists and reporters, so we have no idea how many people actually work in the industry. At the same time, the CRTC has allowed major concentration of ownership. You're probably well aware of the idea that some 90%, 95% of all revenues are collected in TV for the top 4 conventional broadcasters. This is slightly lower lumber and radio, but overall, why have concentration of ownership? Because broadcasters said, and you can see the wonderful quote there, that concentrated ownership provides local stations with financial stability, it gives them more resources, and they will not just maintain, they will strengthen community programming. And in fact, ownership has increased to the point that some 90 or more private commercial television stations are owned by 17 parties, and of those, basically, I'd say 70 to, I have the numbers, just not here, 70 to 80% are owned by the top 4. You have massive concentration of ownership in a very small market, which means that we have very little competition as they have in the United States. You will have different owners competing with each other. We don't have that here. People still got upset because news was being cut. Why? And so the CRTC came up with a new policy last year and implemented it 2 weeks ago in its TV renewals. So it now has introduced a local news expenditure requirement, which has a number of deleterious effects, but one of them is to reduce the proportion of spending from their revenues that is going to go to local news. We're actually going to see a decrease in expenditures on local news. The second thing is that since local programming, except for news, had already been eliminated, almost all of the local programming that left was news. And the CRTC has now said you can reduce news to 3 to 6 hours per week. You have to provide some extra local programming, but you can do reruns. It doesn't matter because there's no requirement for original content for local programming. Central casting is there unabated. And that means that stations themselves do not have to produce or transmit the news. It removes, it entirely creates a network situation where people living in the community no longer make decisions about what's carried or why. What does the CRTC say about local news? Its importance because it's vital to our democracy. You may recall that a few years ago, Omni cut. Rogers' 5 Omni stations eliminated all of their local news and much of their local programming. Many people intervened against that, including our organization. We said, please have Rogers reinstate the programming. It would have cost Rogers $2 million, which made up for their overall parent corporation 0.14% of their total free cash flow. That's not operating revenues, that's not profits, that's money that's sitting in the bank. 0.14 of RCI's total profits, and the CRTC described this as an undue financial burden. Democracy is an undue financial burden. That's what the 0.14% looks, a little white line. So, now, in In other areas, the CRTC has acted. Aboriginal Voices Radio was an Indigenous broadcaster that operated 5 radio stations across Canada. And when it went to its renewal hearing, after many years of problems, none of which are defensible, but after many years of problems, the CRTC chair at its renewal hearing said that AVR's failure to have any staff at some of its stations was astounding. And that's true, it is astounding, because when I did an access to information request, it turned out that in 2006, before AVR was operating without staff, 6 other commercial radio stations were also operating without staff. In 2010, 35 stations were operating with 3 or fewer people. And if one of them is a reporter, there must be really running around an awful lot. Now, we have more detail about this because Genevieve has done some excellent research, and she's going to talk about that now.
2011, when I joined the University of Ottawa on a more permanent basis, I've been involved in 4 different projects, 3 of which are funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Council of Canada. The 4th one that's not there today, I thought by this time you'd be tired of stats and data, so I didn't bring it along, but it would be of interest if you want to look at it. It's called the Worlds of Journalism Study. There are 64 countries participating in this study. And I'm involved in the Francophone side of things in Canada, and my colleague Ivor Shapiro, who's here at Ryerson, takes care of the English side of things, but it's the first study that includes all of Canada in its form. However, the international data set doesn't always include the all of the Francophone Canadians because of the strict methodological aspects that we have to follow, and to prove that many of the small stations, they're small in Francophone stations, so they're not included, but we have included them in the stuff that we're publishing about Canada. But I did want to, this came up because last year when we were talking about this conference, I had data that had to do with local news and journalistic practices, but I'm not actually studying local news per se, but I had all this information, so April's like, why don't you share what you have? So these are some of the highlights that I'm going to show you right now. The first is the radio newsroom study was a case study that I did with 8 journalists and 4 managers between the ages of 21 and 60, 3 women and 14 men, 17 participants representing 9 organizations. And what I found during the study is that participants in those newsrooms had felt that things had remained unchanged or relatively stable over the past 10 years because the same technology was still employed. And this is because radio itself, in the years that I've been studying it, is very conservative in the way that it operates. It's probably one of the most conservative mediums. Financial pressures also were there that reduced their options for going out in the field. So radio journalists are asked to stay in their chairs. And in these organizations also, news has gone down to under 3 minutes in length. And so what do you do at that point as a journalist wanting to do a good job? Well, they end up posting most of their stuff online because they feel some ethical duty to actually do real news. And so that's how they do it. And there's very little training or no training except for marketing purposes to market those stations. So that's what that particular study showed me about that. The other one I did was called Evaluating the Impact of Technology and Funding on Community Radio in Canada. That's just wrapping up now. And I've been looking at funding. So using one particular fund, the Community Radio Fund of Canada money, seeing how those stations fare out in receiving funds or not. And what I've discovered about news, which wasn't related to, I was looking at financial statements and how they're using their money. So, but along the way, in some of the interviews and things that people have said, there are different types of news. And that I think that's something we need to be conscious of, that not everyone defines news in the same way. And for community stations, their way of looking at news can be as simple as having a music concert this evening. And that for them is very crucial news because a lot of the work that they do, marketing and else, has to do with the musical scene in many of the cities. Community radio is still struggling and their debt situation needs to be resolved, and they're getting funding by projects, which makes it difficult for sustainability. But I think of the projects I show, although what I have to show is pretty depressing, this is probably where there's, I think, a lot of potential, because it is the sector that is growing the most. And if we can come up with a stable funding model, I think there would be a lot to say about these community stations that are dispersed throughout the country that are already there with the people wanting to be involved. Finally, I'm involved also in the future of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis broadcasting, and I'll plug this really well because it's in 2 weeks, from the 15th to the 17th of June.
And within this, we're discussing obviously what people want in a new policy. So for the policy review, the CRTC hasn't reviewed this policy in over 27 years, whereas other ones are reviewed every 5 to 7, roughly, within the sector. So I think this is very important work that we're doing as a group. But I did find interesting things about news. So while I was in Iqaluit, it showed that radio is still the #1 source for news. So all this discussion about online media, because they don't have the bandwidth and et cetera, isn't relevant to them. And they have no training, and they've been using the same equipment that the CBC gave them in the 1970s. Local news is still a priority. You know, weddings, deaths, someone just got a whole load of fish, come and get some. These are things that are very much relevant to them in all the remote areas. So they need funding, training, and governance among the main things that they need. But in order to do this, we need proper policies that will help support these organizations. And I think out of those 3 studies, that is what I've discovered, is it's the policies that are lacking, because the people are there, they're doing the work, but unfortunately, you know, things aren't happening. And even the commercial sector, I should say that first case study I showed you is in the commercial sector, like all sectors, but a lot was in the commercial sector, and that's where things are dwindling, but they did have money at the time.
Okay, so I'm going to race through the rest of this. But I believe my extensively footnoted 45-page paper will be available at some point, if not through this conference, then on our website. And also the somewhat less footnoted slideshow. The CRTC keeps saying news matters. What do we need to fix this? Well, the first is to recognize that the CRTC is exercising willful disregard for broadcast journalism. Central casting is permitted. We don't know anything about broadcasters' past performance, because decisions are silent about what broadcasters have done with their incredibly valuable licenses. As I mentioned before, we have no data on reporters, news bureaus, levels of original or local news on either radio or TV, and requirements for original local news are the exception. They are rare. I have found 1 case now where we have, out of 100 stations and 600 radio stations, a requirement for original local news. This can change, but only if the legislation change. Now, there's that funny joke about how carpenters see every problem as one needing a nail, because if the only tool they have is a hammer, they need to hit the nails. Law is very much like that. As a lawyer, I see every problem as one that can be solved by law and enforcement. We need to change the Broadcasting Act to regulate in the public interest, require regulation in the public interest. That is not a requirement now. We also need to change the fact that today only CRTC decisions and CRTC orders can be challenged before the court. That means that policies, such as the one that has last year redefined news to be talk shows, cannot be changed. I'm going to be very quick. Genevieve is giving me the hook. I just wanted to mention, and you can't see it from here, these kinds of data matter because broadcasters are meeting every week with the CRTC. The guilds, unions, and cultural organizations, you can't see the number there. It's 12 meetings to 147 in the same period of time. We don't have data, as I mentioned before. Those are all the areas where we desperately need empirical, independent, objective, academic research. These, to my mind, as a former researcher, are fairly straightforward and could be done, but we need good, solid, empirical research. Finally, where can you get the data? Actually, there are a whole bunch of places, and the CRTC is the best one. I call it the $5 worth of fun. File in an Access to Information Act. It costs you $5 and a stamp, and you get either a yay, we have some data and you might be able to get it, or B, we don't know what you're talking about, which is kind of shocking often. I wanted to emphasize the importance of journalists, not just to collect, and researchers in journalism, not just to collect data, but to advocate. There's no journalistic advocacy before the CRTC. I think our group was about the only one during the renewals that covered billion-dollar corporations say, please require original local news. Thank you. If you want to look at some of our brilliant interventions, which are also extensively documented, they have more tables, they have more numbers, they have more charts. They're online at frapsi.net. Thank you so much.
Next we have Amanda Boyce, who's a PhD candidate in the Communication and Culture Department at York University. Her research interests include broadcast policy, public service broadcasting, new media, and journalism. She was the 2016 recipient of the Dalton Camp Award for Best Essay written by a post-secondary student. Her essay was entitled Funeral for a Friend, a Eulogy for the Late Richmond Review.
Sorry. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I know, especially for those of you who are at CCA, it's been a very long, amazing but long week. I want to kind of preface this by saying that I do most of my research around national news departments at various public broadcasters. I think part of that is because I didn't really feel too concerned about local news until relatively recently. And that was because I grew up in a town that had 2 local newspapers. They were they were owned by 2 different companies. We were very well served, and then a few years ago, one of them closed. And the Dalton Camp essay that I wrote was about, the problem that we're seeing now in local news. And in BC, we had Glacier and Black Press do this big trade-off where they said that, we're not going to close anything, and then, of course, they did. And so we're seeing a lot of these types of things happening. So I grew more and more concerned about local news in Canada after that particular incident. And one of the things that I was really struck by was the fact that there are a lot of problems that we encounter when we're studying local news. One of them is really the lack of data, which I know that a lot of people have been talking about here, is that it's really difficult to do good work around local journalism when there's really not a lot of access to good and solid data. The other one is a definitional problem. And I was looking, as I was preparing for this, at CTV, Global News, at what they were offering and as far as local goes online. And I was trying to find Global News's section on all of the different places that they're in. And you'll see that BC is a location that you can choose, as is the Okanagan. So BC being a province, the Okanagan being a region, so it's made up of various cities, but then you have, Regina, you have Saskatoon and Toronto. So the way that we're categorizing, or the way that we're talking about what is local, it's not consistent, and there's no consistency across that, which raises all sorts of problems as well. So I really wanted to frame my presentation today on this idea of municipalities, and who is really going to be watching City Hall after all of the journalists are gone. And if you read my abstract before this, you'll know that my answer for you is the CBC, which I'll get to in a second. So just a few things about local news in Canada that we all know, especially from various presentations that have gone on already at this conference. We're seeing a lot of station closures. We're seeing a lot of newspaper closures. There are monopolies increasingly in more and more communities, smaller communities. So if you're looking at places like Smithers in BC or Kitimat, you may only have one reporter, and if you're lucky, also an editor working in that community, and that's a real problem. They need to cover everything in the city, and they need to do layout, they do photography, they do social, and it's a really, really big job. There are fewer and fewer resources as well, which means, among other things, that local newspapers are no longer in Ottawa covering their MPs. They don't have that really kind of robust idea of political coverage for their communities. So David Terrace wrote a really great book called Digital Mosaic, and he quotes Christopher Waddell, who's a journalism professor at Carleton, who just is kind of highlighting this idea that Ottawa bureaus by virtually all of Canada's local newspapers have been closed, and that's meant that there's really far less coverage of local MPs. And, television and radio, they're not there either for these local communities, and that's a really big problem when you go to vote, because you vote for your local MP. You don't, well, some people take into consideration the leader, but we have that option here in Canada where we're electing a local representative. And there's fewer and fewer reporters being assigned to City Hall now than 25 years ago. And that is from a book that was published back in 2008. So you can imagine in 2017 now, with all of the different trends that we're seeing, that, you know, it's continued to get worse and worse. But there's a few reasons for this, one of them being that national news is a lot more cost-effective to make than local news is. And that comes down to basic economies of scale. And the market really doesn't reward news organizations for providing a really critical public service. So they don't, there's no incentive really for news organizations based on this idea of the market is, you know, you're trying to get the biggest audience that you want, and how do you do that? Like we've heard about viral content and stuff like that, which is not necessarily going to be that local content. And of course, we all know that journalism is facing technological disruption, and the financial model that they've really depended on isn't really there anymore. So we're seeing all of these problems come up at the same time. And it's really enhanced this idea of market failure, where the market isn't really capable of providing us with the news that we really need to act as citizens on a local level. Which is very, very important because so many decisions that we make are local. Part of this is also because news is one of those things where there are external benefits. So you don't have to actually consume news yourself in order to benefit from the fact that there are people out there collecting it, which is a very big problem because, again, the market doesn't reward news organizations for providing a critical service. So you don't have to pay for the news in order to actually consume it. Particularly like for television, if you think about going over to, you know, a friend or a family member's house, you can sit there and watch the local news with them without actually having to pay in order to get access to it. But again, you benefit from the fact that, you know, the news is out there. Even if you don't go to a friend or family member's house, you still benefit from the fact that, you know, investigative journalism is very important and it holds people to account. So again, even if you're not consuming the news, you're still benefiting from the fact that it is out there. And we want people to be informed voters. And how are we informed as voters? We're informed through our journalists and through media. We do recognize in Canada, though, how important local news is. And, you know, we had our local programming improvement fund, which unfortunately was phased out. But there were commissioners at the CRTC who had dissenting opinions on this and really didn't want the local programming improvement fund to be shut down. And this is just a quote here from one of the dissenting opinions, and it really highlights that it's local media that provides most Canadians with critical information for their understanding of local, national, and international news. So even if you're paying attention to international news, it's really beneficial to look at it through a local lens, and you need your local media in order to provide that lens for you. So in correcting market failure, what we often do is, you know, governments come up with policies, and there are various tools of policy implementation. So one of them, of course, being the Local Programming Improvement Fund. But for Canada, one of the ways that we've really tried to correct market failure in our media industries is through the CBC, which is our lovely national public broadcaster. This is a graph, though. It's from back in 2013, but there hasn't been changes really in where they're located. But there are 47 little red dots there. All of them have news gathering operations. But you'll see that there's huge chunks of the country that are not covered. So the CBC is not actually operating there, which is very problematic. So I just want to kind of contextualize this by saying that we have 338 electoral districts in Canada, and there are over 5,000 municipalities, and yet the CBC is only in 47 communities. And 47 does seem like a lot, especially when you compare it to other broadcasters. But again, like the scope of the country, there's a lot of areas that are not being covered. And part of this is that there were communities that were being covered that aren't being covered anymore. Again, in David Terrace's book, he really talks about how the CBC messed up on the local news front. So he says that perhaps the corporation's most astonishing miscalculation was the wholesale retreat from local news in key media markets in the early 1990s. So they did have more to offer in like popular offerings when it comes to local and regional broadcast back in the 90s, and they tried to re-implement them, but their audiences just really didn't come back. So their entire plan around local broadcasting hasn't really panned out. They do have an expressed interest in local, though. They do a strategic plan every 5 years in their 2020 plan called A Space for Us All. They really emphasize being more local as a focus of where they're moving. Their aim is to have news continue to drive to more investigative and in-depth reporting, creating public affairs agenda and continuing to be the news service of record for the country. And they really want to be more digital, which is great for a lot of Canadians, but it does put some Canadians at a disadvantage. And you know, the idea of, especially here in Canada, mediums are very important. It matters, you know, television, radio, online. Not everybody has the same or equal access to online, but that's an entirely different discussion. And I just wanted to highlight the fact that the CRTC's latest license renewal, again, it has this expressed interest in local. But if you actually look at the plan, what the CBC proposed as far as local goes is an increase in local news and information, but the increase would be in major markets. So we're talking about Calgary, Edmonton, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver, which are already pretty well served by private industry. And there would be potential decreases, although they insisted that they would not decrease, but in places like Halifax, Regina, Winnipeg, and Yellowknife. And there really wasn't any discussion of like, are we going to expand into other local markets? So just quickly in conclusion, we know that the market really isn't able, particularly in Canada, to provide democracies with the news that they really need to function and to act as local citizens. And as we're grappling with what's next for news and how to fix a broken but essential system, the CBC has very great potential to be one of those tools of policy implementation where we're ensuring that Canadians all have access to news. It just really hasn't come into fruition yet. And part of that is that it really needs more resources to do so. And again, like Canada needs more data. We need more data to help formulate effective public policy. If we don't know where the holes really are, and part of where the holes really are is the number of journalists that are actually serving these communities is a very important part. But if we don't have data on that, it's hard to formulate and implement effective policy. And of course, I just quickly a note that this is obviously within the context of ensuring freedom of the press. And that's it.
Absolutely. So less and less topical promotion isn't as important, only because people are PVRing prime time. a lot more than usual. It's not to say it doesn't work. I think it works within your own newscast to promote to the next day or to the next show topically, but it's can be less effective unless it's some huge investigative thing that only your station has, and you can kind of milk it for a couple days and stuff like that. But so it was definitely image branding. So this is why we're the #1 newscaster. This is why you should watch us. And then also would be proof of performance, which would be, we did so great on this story and you missed it, but if you tune in, this is the kind of stuff you're going to get from us. So so POPs, which are proof of performance, and image would be the biggest things that we saw in the States. And then in Canada, not so much. I mean, we do that at Global just because I have such little airtime, but CTV does a little more topical stuff, but yeah.
I had a question for Monica. Just yesterday and also part of today, I had women in my home community contacting me over a radio host. They'd shown up at a protest, and this radio host was giving out their phone numbers and drummed up his troll on the phone. He does this all the time.
On air?
Always women, right?
On air?
Yes. Yeah, he does. So I said, lodge a complaint, here's the link, here's how you do it, do it in 4 weeks. And now what I'm hearing is oh my God, didn't stand a chance. So why hasn't that been changed? Why do you think those new appointees haven't come in? Why? Because it's 2017. Why isn't it?
It's important to view the CRTC as a body that protects the interests of those it has licensed, period. That's why when I said we have to change the Broadcasting Act to mandate a public interest requirement, it's because there is no requirement in the law for the CRTC to serve the public interest. Number two, the CRTC is now delegating much of its authority, and it's questionable as to whether it is lawful for it to delegate authority to the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council, which will turn around and hold a small proceeding and say, gosh darn it, the broadcaster apologized. Isn't that wonderful? So that's that. That's the end of the problem, and the broadcaster can reoffend and reoffend and reoffend, because by delegating it to a self-regulatory code and self-regulatory body, you remove it from the concept of, is this the best person to hold this valuable license, which is why a license exists. Suppose you're driving, I assume most of you have driver's licenses. Suppose you, and it's a tragedy, you go blind in both eyes. Do you think the law ought to stop you from driving? We say yes to protect the other drivers and keep insurance rates down, but we don't do that for broadcasting because we have moved from a model of licensing in the public interest to protecting business interests, and there's nothing wrong with business. I'm in private business too. I like business. But if you want the public interest to be protected, there must be a change to the Act, and for your friends, acquaintances, and colleagues who are damaged by this, I urge them not just to write to the CRTC, but to repeatedly write to the CRTC, to the Secretary General, to start getting tapes of the broadcast, to quote them directly. You could try writing directly to the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council. It is not my first choice. And when the CRTC says, as it will, we are directing this to the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council, it is entirely within your right to say, no, we would like you to investigate. You have a power under the Act to investigate. Sorry, I'm going on.
That's because I saw that link, but when I went to get the link to the complaints thing, it went
straight to the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council. Right. It's an industry-established self-regulatory body, and its main goal is not to solve anything, because that would affect business. This is not being mean. It's not being nasty. It's just saying it's not in the business of ensuring high quality, because, for instance, try searching their database. They have no database that's searchable, so you can't track. If you wanted to say, look at the number of abusive contents in broadcasting to see if it's changed year by year, you will have to print out several thousand individual decisions to figure it out. Good luck with that.
I was wondering if the CBC has any regulations around pure online broadcasting, it's not television.
They've exempted it fully in 1997 on the grounds that online broadcasting has no impact. on the implementation of the Section 3 policy objectives. And I had a brilliant set of pages in my PowerPoint explaining why that's no longer true, but I ran out of time because Genevieve was nasty. So the bottom line is that it's interesting that these days broadcasters commonly say, we are going out of business, stop regulating us because online is eating our cake. So the problem is that if online is eating their cake, then online now does have an impact on the Section 3 objectives. Therefore, you would think that the CRTC would at least think about opening up the door to regulating some type of broadcasting. Not every little user. Nobody wants users regulated. Nobody wants Facebook regulated in that way now. However, the Commission has said no on at least 5 different occasions that I can think of. So until the Act is changed, we are helpless because, as I said before, and it seems odd, you're all grown-ups. We know that CRTC policies are decisions, but when you read the Broadcasting Act, the only thing that can be appealed is a decision or a policy. And I had another brilliant page that Genevieve made me take out, but it was talking about the fact that an average appeal of a CRTC decision, I would estimate as a lawyer, and I've consulted some friends because I thought, no, like $150,000 minimum to start the appeal. Now you have to argue that that thing that we're appealing is a policy, but really, trust us, it's a decision. That's easily another 50. You're looking at $200,000 to start, and I can tell you, having run cake baking sales, that's a lot of cake you got to sell in order to make that money. Easier to change the Act.
Just to know if in Canada you have a digital radio. For example, in France, it's launching now and it's very painful and the long processes for different reasons.
Je pourrais peut-être vous répondre en français un peu plus tard, but for the moment, your question is whether or not we have digital radio in Canada. Yes, we do, and it's never been paid a great deal of attention. I recall when they started to implement the digital radio requirements, they started out by having very convoluted processes, and they finally gave up because of the difficulties. It was a technological problem primarily. We wanted to be on board with the United States rather than on board with EU decision-making. So it's gotten very little attention. Genevieve probably knows far more.
I think it's... His name's, I want to say Brian. I'm horrible with names, by the way, but it's O'Neill, that's for sure. And if you look up O'Neill and digital radio, he's written basically the history of digital radio in Canada, and you can look it up. There's the wonderful, I think he has 2 or 3 articles about it, and basically explains how we were at the forefront, and which is the truth. We were doing a great job, but it was just like a VHS beta situation. So the U.S. didn't go along with that, and then we were stuck with whatever technology we had chosen at the time, and it was a complete kaput. And that's why when we were talking about TV situation, we took a very different approach at the time.
I should mention that the Broadcasting Act, which is really important because it's the law, and the law really matters, I can't emphasize that enough, the law does require the CRTC to take changes in technology into account and to be flexible in its regulation to ensure technical project progress. So there are requirements and statutes for that as well.
Yeah.
Sherry, I'm really intrigued by this idea of the VRIN approach. I think it's awesome, and I'm wondering, how do you do that and also create enough content to keep up with the news cycle?
That's a great question. Content is key. And I like the way you ended your presentation as far as local television goes, because it is interesting to look at the network. We work with ABC News, we also work with CNN, and how much they really take our content and make it their own, because that's the only way that they can cover, things across the United States. But content is interesting because more and more I find, and we've just had conversations about this, your traditional AP wire or UPI wire, ABC News 1 feed or CNN feeds is old news. It just is. The news happening is right here. And we ourselves find us more and more, even in our own community, like Kansas City, to find out what's going on in the community. You will see these community pages. It's all on digital. It's all on social media. Even government entities, the smaller ones, police departments, city halls, the district attorney's offices, they all are generating like their own information line in Twitter and Facebook, and we have to mine that for content. Even internationally, we'll know that things are happening, and we can't wait for ABC News to turn a package around. If they do, it's already dated. So in our stream of workflow, we were just talking about this, in our studio, we have to have a workflow in where our talent can constantly be digging for information. Verify it, because that's another thing that we're getting experience doing, because again, if we're going to be the trusted source, we have to have verification, and we're getting faster at that. So even from the local level to the international level, the content is king, but it is ever flowing, and you have to learn how to try to manage that. We try to teach that. We try to make sure that everybody's keeping their eyes and ears open on that. Even police scanners that we used to listen to, you can find out things, really what's going on in a Twitter feed versus anything else, the traditional. So I think it's constantly changing. But yeah, the content, turning it around, making sure that it's new and not repetitive is something that we constantly look at as far as workflow goes. And because if we're going to continue to expand news, we can't be repetitive, old, irrelevant. We have to be relevant. So great question.
If I could just interject and interrupt all of the questioners, I wanted to say I so much enjoyed all of the presentations here, and in particular, the nice analysis of the difference between the American promos and the Canadian promos. And the fun thing is that it hadn't occurred to me that in my business, that's why central casting matters, because in central casting, all local control is gone. So if an individual station wants to promote a specific thing, maybe it can put in a promo or not, but if the network controls it, local control is gone, which means you have no local promotion, which means you have no local station identity. And for those of you who are into the whole local presence thing, we are eliminating the concept of local community and loyalty to home. Very simply, by not actually dealing with this on a regulatory level. And by the way, the CRTC has been asked to examine central casting, and it is declined because the technology is not far enough advanced for it to take it seriously.
So when I was a producer a long time ago, a promo producer, I had a job because we needed to fill 2 minutes an hour of Canadian promo. And that could be a talk show, it could be news, it could be, a crappy show like Train 48 that
Love
Global had. But so as long as there was 2 minutes of promotion to a Canadian show, ET Canada, whatever, that's why I had a job. But they've taken that away.
What happened, just so you know why that 2 minutes mattered, is because there used to be limits on ads in TV and radio. Yeah. Back in the day, you didn't have to listen to ads 20 minutes an hour. It started out with 0, then it went up to 4, then 6, then 8, then 10. At 12, the CRTC, we've got to promote CanCon, so we won't count any promos to Canadians. So therefore, you got promos to Canadian. That's how. It was cool.
Yeah.
I have a question for Buffy. And just as an aside to show how practical these workshops are, I've been texting back and forth with these women as we speak.
Good.
Giving them that
glad to hear it.
Broadcast evidence, which they really are. So thank you. Buffy, also in terms of practical, I'm wondering, I think your research is really important. I'm wondering where it's going, what you're doing with it, because we have these conglomerates that go before CRTC that talk about not just local news, but community access cable.
Yeah.
Thing they don't want to do, which should happen.
Well, before I went to, I don't know, I saw April speak somewhere, and I can't remember where, but I reached out to her and I said, so funny, I've been doing this research on my own just to prove a point because I was mad. And then she said, oh, you should come in and speak at this local news symposium we're doing. And I said, sure. Well, maybe I should check with my VP first. I don't want to lose my job over anything. So that's why I took names off of there. But I really did it for them to say, look how unfairly we are, because I could point out who we were. We were the ones, Global was the ones that gets the least amount of promo time. So, and I was trying to compare what we do to our competitors like CTV, CBC, and City. And I was trying to prove my point to a whole bunch of VPs, but I mean, I had my news VP on my side, obviously. But, you know, even though I work on news and I take care of national and the website and everything like that, but I unfortunately have to report into marketing. I mean, I love my boss and everything, but I report into marketing. So while he says, no airtime for news for the next 6 weeks, I have to go back to the newsroom and say, sorry, and, you know, and then I'm like looking at my producers and I'm like, I don't know what you're going to do for the next 6 weeks. But
I would say too, that kind of goes back into, you know, what I was going through, and that is you have to be strategic as far as your approach to being successful. And so your strategy has to have that niche, and you have to talk about focus on the content, and you have to reach those people, because ours is about reach and frequency. And trust me, we go back and forth between, you know, marketing, sales news, you know, those sorts of things. We have meetings. We are strategic as far as what we want as far as a reach goes for a image, and you're exactly right. That's what we do. We do image. We do proof of performance, initiatives. But it is as valuable. News is the #1 customer when it comes to sales and marketing. We're treated as the most important client.
And in Canada, it's Survivor and The Apprentice and, you know, The Blacklist, and that's who comes first, because that's where they're making their money.
Well, and
now, but wait till later.
Getting into the money issue, and I wanted to make the point that we had a really interesting discussion on the concept of the business model. How do we get more money to local TV? Well, here's the thing, folks. Total broadcast revenues, radio, TV, okay, last year. This is telecom, okay? So when you go by that old mantra, follow the money to telecom, because we have 4 major broadcasters that collectively between them I'd estimate well over $15 billion in revenues. But who do we license? We license their impoverished subsidiaries. Now, there is some good news on the horizon, because the CRTC just renewed the license of Rogers. And by the way, this is another digression that Genevieve was mean about. But the whole point is that we don't need to relicense Shaw and Global every year. We could just up and say, you know what, you did such a lousy job, we're going to, or we could say to CTV, which has actually had regulatory breaches and got full-term renewals. We don't have to relicense. We can have a competitive licensing system. However, in 1979, the CRTC said we don't have to do that because we're regulating in the public interest. Okay, so here we are, and we have the history of the Omni TV stations, and for anybody who's ever watched that, you've seen the slow elimination of all local news. You know, it was so coincidental about the elimination of local news from the Omni TV stations was that it happened just before a federal election. Yeah. You know, coincidence? And then when we applied 1 month afterwards, well before the election, it took them 7 months to slow walk the decision through. You know what? When you vote in October, it doesn't matter whether you get news back in January, and the CRTC didn't require news back in January in any event. But where I was going with this was that Rogers is now required. It has been ordered to keep the license essentially for 3 more years, but anybody else can apply for those licenses this August. We now have a competitive renewal in play. So there has been a tiniest bit of change.
And it's funny that they've just announced 5 new local stations.
It's got to be a coincidence.
It's just so weird.
You know. So the law and its enforcement are critical here, because we don't have the very dynamic market in the United States. We just don't have it. You have concentration of ownership here. Ours is higher. And the bottom line is that we are looking, I keep thinking of this, and I was so depressed, and I didn't tell Genevieve about my depression, but I told my husband, and I said, all I see is that shot in the first Indiana Jones movie. Were any of you alive to see it when it came out? Because I was there when I saw the original. You remember that scene where the ball is coming down? This is foreign ownership. Because foreign ownership and investment will save our system, because Canadian broadcasters won't. That's going to be the argument.
Well, I was just reading here, though, that the FCC is now rethinking in the United States. These larger groups have gobbled up a lot of local television stations, and so they've increased their, their ownership, not twice over, but 3, 4, 5 times as much. So now there's now I saw that they are like taking a pause and looking at things again. But I think, it's going to go 360, I hope, and I hope that this is the right time for change in Canada and for more investment and look and value into good journalism, because people are experiencing the bad journalism and not having things that are relevant, and they want it, they need it, in order to feel like they can be in control of their own lives and destiny. So I think that there's, hopefully an upside. I like to look at it as a positive, is that if you're going to experience negative and suppression, then you're going to value more what you had and what you can have. So I'm hoping, that's what I tell journalism students. I said, I think your timing's good, because if you're in it for the right reason, I think that you can have an impact, not now, but for future generations. So just don't let up.
Well, thank you, everybody, for all these wonderful presentations, and all of you for attending. I'll ask that we continue the conversation into the other building where we were yesterday for lunch. And if you, yes, Oakham House, and if you haven't registered for a table yet, I think that's all posted in the lobby. If you want to decide which table you'd like to have.
You should come to our table.
We have a policy table, so.
We're going to talk about the law. Yeah. We're fun. We read and we like to drink. So.
Thank you very much.
I think it's table 3. We're the fun people.